All right, so we'll be in 1 Samuel 8 right now. So the last couple of weeks, the first week that we were here 2 weeks ago, we looked into 2 Kings at the story of Elisha and Naaman. And that was at a time when the nation of Israel was divided, like literally northern and southern kingdom. And the last week we saw the story of Elijah when he called down fire from heaven and then he ran from Jezebel. And now we're going a little bit, so we're going through the Bible, we're going through the Old Testament, but kind of like chronologically, so like reverse chronologically. So right now in 1 Samuel 8, we're going to be in a period of time where Israel's not divided yet. And this is going to be right in between the time of the judges and the kings. So the covenant that will be talked about is the covenant between God and his people, where he's going to be their God and he's going to be their king. So Israel at this time, or right actually before this time, they were in a theocracy where they were a chosen nation, like an actual nation, but God was their king. So that's where we had the tabernacle. That's where we kind of learned about that in high school and growing up and stuff, where God was actually their king. Like God physically dwelt among his people. He would speak through different people and actually give them orders and tell them what to do. But we're going to get to a point now where we're studying the Old Testament of God's faithfulness despite Israel's disobedience. And when we look into these stories, when we kind of look into the history of Israel's disobedience and God's faithfulness, it kind of reminds us of our own disobedience, but God's faithfulness towards us as well. So Samuel's going to be mentioned. Samuel was the last of the judges, and he was basically chosen to bridge the gap between the judges and the kings period. So that's where we are right now in 1 Samuel 8. So verse 1 says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel," basically rulers. "The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice." So that's where Israel is at this point, where even the most holy man's or even the most righteous man's sons are turning against God. So that kind of gives us like the temperature gauge of where Israel's at spiritually. So verse 4 continues, "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the other nations.' But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed the voice of the people in a way that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.'" So it got to a point in Israel where people were seeing all these other nations, how they had a king, and they went up to Samuel and they said, "We want a king like everyone else." So even right there, it seems like so innocent, and it seems like you would kind of just read over it and not think much of it. But in that verse, what was it, verse 7, Israel completely rejected God as their king. And they said, "We don't want God as our king. We don't want to be a theocracy anymore. We want to be like everybody else, and we want to have a king." And it's easy to see this in Israel and be like, well, Israel's so stupid. Why would you not want to have God as your king? But I think all of us do that every single day. Like with the decisions that we make, with the way that we act, sometimes the way that we walk, where we don't want God to be the king. We don't want God to be the authority of our lives anymore, where we want to be our own king, or we want to walk like the world. Like we just want to be our own king, and we just want to go walk like the world. And that's what Israel's at right now. So that's why God said they have rejected me, not you. Verse 8 continues, "According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." So God even brings up his history. I brought these people out of Egypt. I brought them out of slavery. I chose them as a nation. I told them how much I love them. I made a covenant with them, yet they still have rejected me. Verse 9, "Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked for a king. So God was basically hearing Israel speak this entire time, saying like, give us a king, give us a king. And God allowed them to have a king. So everything that's going to follow in their history, from them getting Saul as a king to the 3 other kings to a whole sequence of kings where they're going to have these wicked, wicked people. Eventually they're going to split into a nation. Eventually they're going to divide. Eventually they're going to be exiled, killed, tortured, all of this stuff. And it's all because they rejected God as their king. So many times we're kind of living our lives, and so all this bad stuff is happening to us, or all this circumstances that we find ourselves in, we tend to blame God. Like, why is God bringing this in my life? Why is God bringing me this? Well, if we look back, most of the time we brought that upon ourselves. Because you see, it was God's plan for him to be the king, the theocracy, be a theocracy, be the king of Israel. It wasn't necessarily his will for them, or wasn't his plan for them to be ruled by other men. Because God knew, if I hand you over to a physical king, to an earthly king, that your life's going to be so bad. Like, that was the boundary that God wanted to have for them, but they rejected him. And it's the same thing that we always do, where God tells us, hey, no sex before marriage, don't drink, don't get drunk on anything but the Spirit. He gives us what we look at all of these rules, and we're like, oh my gosh, I don't want God as my king, I want to make my own decisions. But then, just as God's going to forewarn Israel, this is what's going to look like. It's like God forewarns us, if you want to go ahead and do the things I'm going to tell you not to do, this is what your life's going to look like. So when your life does get to a point where all of this is happening, don't blame me, because you were the one that wanted to be your own king. You wanted to make your own decisions. And so many Christians and even non-Christians find themselves in a point where their own sin, their own decisions got them to that point. But in reality, it wasn't God doing that to them, or like a big man with a magnifying glass on an anthill just being mean and wicked. It's our own hearts that turned against God and brought that upon ourselves. So verse 11, he's talking about what it's going to look like now with the king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands, and captains over his 50s. Will set to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be performers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, and finest young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us, that we may also be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us and fight our own battles. So it was a complete rejection of, God, we don't want a theocracy. I don't want you ruling over me. I don't want God making the decisions for me. We want to be like everybody else. And I remember learning this in high school, learning this in college, and being like, Israel's so dumb. Like, they're stupid. Why would, if God could be in control of your life and have authority over you, why wouldn't you want to live like that? Why wouldn't you want a theocracy? Why would you want to be like the world? And then I realized I do that every single day. So you see the parallels between us and Israel, where God shows Israel, and his faithful covenant to them was, I'm going to be your God no matter how much you guys reject me. And it's awesome that we're going to see God's faithfulness despite Israel's rejection of him. But this is the point where Israel demands a king. They don't want a theocracy anymore. They want a king. They want to be like everyone else. Israel wants to be their own God. They want to make the decisions for themselves. They want God to be completely out of the equation. So we're going to jump over to 1 Samuel 15. So Saul becomes their first king, and Israel's all stoked because now we have a king. Now we can be like the other nations. But we're going to see real quick how this wasn't God's plan for Israel. He allowed it to happen. He willed this to happen, but this was not his plan for Israel. But since Israel wanted to reject him, God allowed this to happen. So Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord, send me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. So Samuel's going to tell Saul what the Lord just told him. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how we ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So our God is completely judging these people that have gone against Israel. So Samuel's saying, kill every living creature that you see. That's what our God wants. Our God is just, and he sees these people's hearts. These people deserve to die. They have completely rejected God. Their hearts are hardened. So Saul, go out and kill them. So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from the Amalekites. And Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to destroy them. But everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed. So Saul took it upon himself to be his own king, to make his own decisions again. God said, go out and completely destroy everything, but Saul completely disregarded what the Lord said through Samuel to him and said, no, I'm going to keep the really good sheep and the ones that we can use, the oxen that we can use, the people that we can use, I'm going to keep all of them, and then everything that's worthless I'm going to destroy. So again, Saul acts just like we do, just like Israel does, wants to be his own king, wants to be his own God, and completely goes against what God says. Verse 10, now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king. This is God talking. I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself, and he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. So Saul sees Samuel, and Saul puts on this fake religious act. So he literally says, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Like very religious talk. And we almost hear people talk like that sometimes, like, blessed be the God, blessed be, oh, there's Samuel, like, that's so awesome. Saul's putting on a completely religious act, a completely religious front, and Saul even says, I've performed the commandment of the Lord, but that's a blatant lie. But Samuel said in verse 14, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? So Samuel says, you didn't do what God said. I hear the sheep like baying, and I hear the oxen like mooing, whatever they do. Like, I hear the sheep. I know you're lying to me, Saul. And Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. But he says, for the people spared. So Saul automatically shifts the blame from himself to the people. Oh, okay, Samuel, I know that you hear the sheep and the ox and all that, but the people did that. I had nothing to do with it. Whoever I commanded, they must not have heard me correctly. Then Samuel said to Saul, be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. So verse 17 continues, so Samuel said, when you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission which he had sent me, and I brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But verse 21, again he makes an excuse. But the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which could have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God. So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may worship the Lord. And you see, Saul kind of puts on this front again where he's like, oh my gosh, I've sinned, I know you're right, but if Saul would have been serious in his apology, he would have listened to the Lord in the first place. And we know that Saul isn't actually sincere in his apology, because if he was actually sincere and turned his heart back to God, the Lord probably would have given him another chance. But God saw through Saul's heart and was like, there's no way I'm going to allow you to be king. You've completely gone against me in your own heart. So we're going to continue on to chapter 16. So we see in chapter 8 and chapter 15, Israel completely has rejected God. They want their own king. They get Saul. God anoints Saul. And Saul does the same thing as Israel does and completely wants to be his own king, completely hardens his own heart and just does whatever he wants to do. And now we're going to see David anointed as a king. So in chapter 16, verse 1, now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And that's how twisted Saul was at this point. If Saul were to hear that a new king were to come, he was going to kill Samuel, a prophet of God, and he was going to kill that new king. So that's even more how far Saul's heart was. But the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You shall anoint for me the one I named you. So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, do you come peaceably? And he said, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited him to the sacrifice. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So he saw one of Jesse's sons, and he must have been this super tall, athletic, like good-looking guy. And he goes, oh my gosh, this dude's perfect for the job. Surely this must be him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And this is what's going to lead God to Daniel. But this is also what kind of the Lord does with us, where just how Saul tried to put on that religious front, we, like as people, we can easily fool other people. Like, you can put on such a great act, and what my professor likes to say is speak Christianese. Like, you can come to any Bible study, any Bible college, anywhere, and be the best sounding Christian that you can be. You can know all the Old Testament and the New Testament. You can speak Christianese like what he says, all of his awesome words and stuff. You can show up to every Bible study, have perfect attendance, but God knows your heart, and God sees your heart. And if you're doing things for the wrong reasons, for earthly means, for earthly gains, if you're trying to impress other people, or if your heart's not really there, you're just kind of going to church because your family does, or I'm just kind of going to Bible study because a couple of my friends are going and I don't really want to go, but they're my bride, so I guess I have to go. God sees the heart, and God judges the heart. And that's what's cool here, and with so many of our Bible studies, is we don't care about being flashy. We don't care about numbers or elaborate anything, because all we're doing is reading God's word. So God looks at the heart, and that's why he rejected the first son. So Jesse called this dude's name and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen him. And this happens a few times. Neither has the Lord chosen him. The Lord has not chosen him. The Lord has not chosen him. And we skip along to verse 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep. So they go through like 7 kids, like these 7 awesome, athletic, good-looking for the position kids where, okay, this dude can be king, he can be king, he can be king. And God's looking at these people's heart and saying, no, but there is one more person. He's out there, he's the youngest son, he's out there keeping his sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. Verse 12, so he went and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose and went to Ramah. So we see Israel completely rejects God as king. And then as the summer moves forward, we'll go backwards in the Bible more and more and see the actual covenants and the promises that God makes his people. But the covenant that God made with Abraham is, I'm going to bless your people. And it was a covenant. It wasn't a promise. So a promise can be broken. A promise is basically a one-way street. It's like holding a piece of string, where I can promise to you, but if one of us breaks it, the whole promise is destroyed. But God made a covenant with Abraham, just as he did with Moses, just as he did with all of his Old Testament characters. And a covenant is a two-way street. And it kind of reminds me of that circuit, like did we ever learn that in science class, how on a Christmas tree, if all the Christmas lights are connected with one string, if one goes out, they all go out? But nowadays we have like a compound type of little system where if one light goes out, the rest of the lights stay on. That's just how God's faithfulness, that's just how God's covenant is with Israel. So Israel rejects him as king, but that does not break the promise of sending a Messiah, of sending a Savior. So in chapter 8, we saw them completely reject God as king, God as Lord. So God gives them Saul. And we see what happens with Saul is exactly what God had forewarned him, like forewarned his people. Like, okay, if this is what you really want, life is going to be tough. And this dude's going to roll over you. He's going to be wicked. Okay, I'm warning you. Here you go. And God does that with our sinful lives too. So it can come to a point where we can keep going against the Lord, keep going against the Lord. And even in Romans 1, Paul says, there will come a time that the Lord is going to let us basically leave him and go into that sinful state. And whatever happens during that time, it's almost like God has his hands off of our life for a moment, saying, whatever happens now, you're bringing upon yourself. But our God's a faithful God. He's always there for us to turn around. But I think so many of us put ourselves in this situation because of our own sin, our own choices, and then we get mad and blame God for putting us there. But we see what happens with Saul, and we see the evilness basically that happens. But even though it wasn't God's original plan for them to have kings or to have an actual physical king basically in charge of Israel, God was still faithful in his promise. So it was cool to see how God can look at a situation where, okay, Saul is king. I made a covenant with these people that I'm going to send a Messiah through them. So I have to find someone whose heart is basically blameless towards me. So even in the midst of Israel's unfaithfulness, he brings David up. And as we see later, if you were to read on the story of David and Bathsheba, David isn't a perfect person, but his heart is so bent towards worshiping the Lord, so bent to following the Lord, that God was faithful to Israel and brought David in. And it just reminds us of how God's faithfulness from Saul to David is just as strong as was in the Old Testament and the New Testament as he is today. Despite Israel completely rejecting him, despite them wanting a king, despite them wanting not a theocracy, but to have God not be in control anymore, God was like, I still love my people. I'm going to send David. I'm going to anoint David as king. And then who do we learn who's the son of David in the New Testament? It's Jesus. So even in the midst of all of this, God's like, I'm still going to send you David, because there's absolutely nothing that you can do to make your guys' self right with me, because Israel, honestly, you're going to keep screwing up. So I'm going to fix your mess. And it was also a cool foreshadowing too. Chuck Smith, the pastor of Calvary Chapel, before he passed away, made a cool point and said, just as Saul wasn't the rightful king in chapter 15 and 16, when Saul wasn't the king anymore and David was anointed, but Saul was still reigning, but David was the true king, that is a perfect foreshadowing of what it's like today with Satan and Jesus. So today, when we're looking and we're thinking, why is there so much evil in the world? Why is so much happening? Why is this happening in the media? Why is this happening in our country? Why are Christians being killed? Because Satan's the king right now. Like, he's ruling right now. But the cool thing is that Satan's a counterfeit, just like Saul was. Satan isn't the actual king, because we saw an anointed Messiah in Jesus in the New Testament come, and Jesus is the rightful king. So just as Saul was that lame duck type of king where he was afraid of losing his power, he was afraid of all of this, it's exactly how Satan is right now. And Satan knows that there's been an anointed king. Satan knows that Jesus is the rightful king, and that's why we have power over the dark forces in the name of Jesus, is because that's not the rightful king, that's not the rightful heir. And there's going to come one day when Christ is going to come back, when the new heaven's going to come here, and Christ is going to sit on the actual throne of heaven and on earth.